The first thing they felt was the heat. Not the dry, familiar warmth of summer over the plains of Wallachia, but a rolling, suffocating wall of furnace air that moved faster than the wind itself. It came crawling over the flat fields outside Ploiești, like a living thing, pressing against faces, pushing smoke into throats, making eyes sting and water until shapes blurred and the world turned into an orange smear. Out in the distance, where the lines of pipelines and pumping stations cut across the dark earth, a row of storage tanks had vanished behind a curtain of flame. From each torn cylinder, crude oil spilled out, caught fire, and streamed away as if someone had poured a river straight from hell onto the Romanian soil. Men who had once joked that no bomb could find their little piece of steel now saw their silhouettes outlined in flickering light as the ground itself burned and the sky churned with black smoke. And in that moment, the myth of safety, carefully built with sandbags, flak guns, and German promises, collapsed in a roar louder than any siren. Hours earlier, in a different shade of night, the guards had believed they were untouchable. The oil was life. Everyone knew disso. But here, they thought life was too important to lose. Romania had become the fuel station of the Reich, and Ploiești was its beating heart, pushing blood made of petroleum through steel arteries that stretched north and west toward German refineries and tank parks. On maps in Berlin and Bucharest, those long black lines looked like strength, pipelines and train routes, pumping stations and depots, all under guard, all protected by anti-aircraft guns and fighter patrols. The Americans had tried once, in 1943, coming low and brave in an operation that left the field smoking and the ground littered with broken bombers. But the oil had flowed again. To the men standing watch in 1944, that was proof that this place was different, that this network of valves and pipes and tanks was too vital, too well defended to be truly threatened. They laughed at rumors of saboteurs, at stories of precision bombing from high altitude, at whispered tales of spies slipping through shadows. The war felt far away, even when the sky glowed faintly on the horizon. Sergeant Ion Marinescu had spent 2 years guarding oil that did not belong to him. The pipeline stretched past his watch post in a shallow ditch, a dull metal tube under a thin curtain of earth, running between low pumping stations with their blinking lights and rumbling machinery. In the beginning, he had been nervous, checking his rifle compulsively, jumping at every engine sound in the night. In 1942, the Germans had told him that Soviet agents wanted to blow this line, that enemy planes were coming, that every shadow could hide a saboteur. But the trains kept moving, the pumps kept humming, and nothing happened except long shifts, cheap cigarettes, and the same flat landscape in every direction. By 1944, Ion had come to see the pipeline the way a farmer sees a familiar fence. Always there, always solid, part of the scenery. On quiet nights, he would lean against the sandbag revetment, listening to the faint hiss of pressure inside the line and the chatter of the other guards, while distant artillery on the eastern front rumbled like a storm he'd never have to walk through. The Germans liked to talk about how safe it all was. Oberleutnant Otto Vogel, a lean Luftwaffe officer with sharp cheekbones and eyes that never quite smiled, had arrived the previous year to help coordinate air defense around the oil region. He came from a world of technical briefings, altitude tables, and flak patterns, and he loved his boards covered in colored pins and strings. During one inspection, he'd assembled the Romanian guards in the yard beside the pumping station, the smell of oil thick in the air, and used a chalkboard to sketch how an Allied raid would die over Ploiești. They tried once, he said, tapping the board where a line of little bombers wound into a thick cluster of X's representing anti-aircraft fire. They sent brave men, yes, low-level, reckless. They paid the price. We have guns, we have fighters, we have smoke generators. They would be fools to attempt the same again. The guards had nodded, some impressed, some bored, and when he finished, Ion had turned to his friend Petre and muttered that, if this was all true, they could sleep through their shifts and the oil would still be safe. But of course, nothing in 1944 was truly safe. Far to the southwest, in the dusty airfields of southern Italy, rows of American bombers waited in the early morning darkness like metal cattle, their bellies packed with explosives and incendiaries meant not for cities, but for one thing, oil. There, Lieutenant Jack Monroe sat beneath the wing of a B-24 Liberator, helmet half-buckled, watching ground crews fuss over bomb racks and fuel valves while he tried to silence the memory of briefing room maps. On those maps, Ploiești and its surrounding fields had been circled in red, the pipelines traced like veins and labeled with tonnage figures and fuel consumption charts. The first raid, he'd been told, had cost many crews dearly, and the scars of that operation meant the Germans would be wary. But, the briefing officer had said, pointer tapping the lines to Romania, they still think they can shield this place behind flak and smoke. They believe it's a fortress, We're going to prove it's a tinderbox. The plan had changed since 1943. No more heroically low runs, weaving between smokestacks and flak towers. Instead, they would come higher, more often, pounding refineries, storage tanks, rail yards, and pumping centers until the entire system shuddered and failed. Yet even the Americans knew bombs alone might not be enough. Oil was stubborn. If one tank died, another could be filled. If one line burned, a bypass could be laid. Somewhere, in quiet rooms far behind the front, intelligence officers had started to ask a different question. What if the system could be broken from within? What if, instead of trying to destroy every visible piece of Ploiești's oil empire, they made its own arteries bleed at the worst possible moment? In the alleys of Ploiești itself, where the refinery chimneys cast long shadows over narrow streets, a woman named Elena Ionescu moved through the crowd with the practiced calm of someone who knew how to be invisible. To her neighbors, she was a widow, another face in the line for bread, another figure carrying coal or water. They knew her husband had gone to the front and never returned, and they assumed her quietness came from grief. Few guessed that at night, in the back room above a mechanic's workshop, she sat at a scarred table with men who unfolded maps and whispered about valves, gauges, and pumping schedules instead of battles and uniforms. The resistance had many forms in Romania: students sneaking leaflets, railway workers delaying trains. But Elena belonged to a small, very specific chain, one that passed information on fuel output and pipeline pressure to men who spoke with foreign accents and carried radios in false bottom crates. On the eve of the Great Fires, Elena sat in that smoky room while a bald technician with oil-stained hands traced a finger along a pencil line on a map. "Here and here," he said, tapping two pumping stations. "The pressure is highest when the trains are delayed. The tanks fill, the lines choke. If during a heavy flow, these valves are sabotaged, we don't just get a leak. We get," he hesitated, searching for a word. And another man, a former refinery engineer, supplied it. "We get rivers," he said softly. "Rivers where there were no rivers before." Elena listened, her eyes steady. The coordinator, a man with tired eyes who used a false name even inside the group, looked directly at her. "Can you reach them?" he asked. She thought of the guard she had once known as a boy in her street, now posted near one of those stations, the way he'd tried to impress her years ago by talking about his army service. "Perhaps," she replied. "If he still believes nothing can touch his precious pipes, it might be easier than you think." Back at the pipeline outpost, Ion was grumbling about boredom when the first Allied raid of that week began. It started as a distant growl, a vibration that trembled through the wooden walls of the small guard shack before the men even recognized it as sound. Then came the siren's wail from the refinery zone, rising and falling, carried by the wind. They stepped outside into the twilight and squinted toward Ploiești, where a pale haze was already forming over the chimneys. "Another drill," Petra said half-heartedly, but when a burst of flak sparkled far up in the sky like dark flowers blooming, Ion felt something twist in his stomach. They had seen raids before, spots of light, dull thumps of distant explosions, but the pipeline itself had never been seriously hit. Their officers told them it was too narrow a target, too boring, too deep in the defense zone. The real prize was always the refineries. Their job, they'd been told, was mostly to keep an eye out for saboteurs and stay ready. The first bombs of that day's raid fell on the storage tanks near the main refining complex. High explosive cracked metal shells open, and incendiaries followed, clinging to oil with greedy tongues of flame. For men in the fields, it was like watching the horizon catch fire. Thick smoke rolled upward, the power of the flames staining the clouds. The anti-aircraft guns thumped in endless rhythm, hammering at the sky, and Vogel's crews shouted coordinates and adjustments as if numbers alone could shield steel. From his command post, the Oberleutnant watched the bombers through binoculars, tracking their formations, calling for fighter interception, trying to imagine their view of the maze below. He still believed in his flak umbrella, in his arcs of fire and layers of defense. The refineries might take damage, yes, but the system would hold. It always had. High above that flower of fire, Jack Monroe's bomber shuddered as flak bursts blossomed around it, black puffs that rocked the plane and rattled every bolt. Through the front plexiglass, he saw the target area smeared with smoke, the neat shapes from the briefing map replaced by boiling clouds. The bombardier cursed under his breath. "Hard to see," he muttered, adjusting the Norden sight. Jack felt sweat trickle down his back despite the cold at altitude. Somewhere in the static-filled world of radio, voices crackled, calling for tighter formation, reporting hits, screaming in sudden silence. He couldn't see pipelines from this height, just the suggestion of lines and roads, but he knew each cluster of tanks and towers fed something that stretched far beyond the city's edges. They weren't just dropping on factories, they were hammering a network. Whether they hit the precise marks or not, something down there would snap. Yet even as bombs smashed tanks and set warehouses ablaze, the pipelines themselves remained largely intact. Buried, narrow, and spread over miles, they were harder to target blindly. That was where the arrogance of their defenders became their weakness. A man who believes a thing cannot be touched will not watch it closely when the real danger approaches from another angle. Over weeks and months, raids followed raids, and the guards grew used to thunder in the distance, to pillars of smoke, to occasional orders to assist with fire control closer to the city. Each time, they returned to their quiet lines and reassured each other that the real war was somewhere else, that their section was safe. To Ion, the bombs became a strange, detached spectacle, terrifying for those under them certainly, but no more real to him than a storm over a far valley. Elena's opportunity came on a humid afternoon, when the air felt heavy and metallic, and the usual buzz of mosquitoes was drowned by the hum of generators. She approached the edge of the pipeline zone carrying a sack of tools, accompanied by the mechanic whose workshop hid their secret meetings. Their papers said they were there to inspect auxiliary equipment. The German clerks barely glanced at them. Locals working around the oil installations were common enough, and the bureaucracy was too busy counting output barrels to worry about every pair of calloused hands. Elena's heart beat faster when she recognized Ion near the gate, rifle slung casually over his shoulder, cap tilted back. He seemed older than she remembered, but his smile came easily when he saw her, shaped by memories of a time before war, when they had walked the same schoolyard. "What brings you into our mighty fortress?" he joked, gesturing at the rows of pipes and small buildings behind him. She let herself laugh lightly, using the part of her that still remembered how to pretend. "I go where they tell me," she said. "Seems your precious oil needs more coddling than a child." He puffed his chest a little. "The Germans say this line is more protected than the king himself. Saboteurs, bombers, no one can touch it." The mechanic beside her played his part to perfection, rolling his eyes. "Then you won't mind if we poke around those valves near Station 17, he said. "If they're as untouchable as you say, our work will be quick." Ion waved them through, signing the log without truly reading it. Why would he? It was just another day, another visit from technicians, another reminder that the system was robust enough to tolerate even their clumsy hands. Inside the fenced station, with the sound of the generators masking their voices, the mechanic led Elena to the cluster of valves and gauges they'd marked on the map. He worked with practiced movements, his fingers moving over metal, unscrewing housings, adjusting a pressure relief assembly that to any casual observer would look as if he was following orders. In truth, he was setting a trap. One valve was left slightly misaligned, another fitted with a weak point where stress would break it easily. A small packet, sealed and almost invisible, was fixed beneath a joint where a faint spark could do the rest. Elena watched, learning each step by heart. She knew that if he was arrested, someone would have to finish his work elsewhere along the line. When they left, the station looked unchanged, the steel still gleaming, the gauges still ticking. Only the future had been altered. Time in war rarely moves in neat lines. It jerks and lurches, accelerates without warning, then stalls in long stretches of anxious waiting. For weeks after Elena's visit, nothing catastrophic happened. The raids continued on their grim schedule, the refineries took more hits, and the German officers spoke in increasingly strained tones about output quotas and repair crews. The pipelines groaned under the strain of a damaged system forced to push more through fewer intact routes. At night, when he couldn't sleep, Ion sometimes heard the faint, ghostly rumble of oil rushing through metal beneath the earth, like a buried river speaking in a language he couldn't understand. He still believed in the fortress, but every new column of smoke from Ploiești stole a little more of that certainty. Far above the Balkans, the 15th Air Force was changing its rhythm too. Weather, enemy fighter activity, and shifting priorities moved Ploiești up and down the target list. But the chain of strategy still pointed back to Romanian oil as a vital artery. Each successful strike on a tank farm or cracking unit was logged in reports, and intelligence officers compared production figures with the ideal lines on their charts. Slowly, painfully, those figures began to drop. The Germans compensated with fuel from elsewhere, with rationing and desperate reallocation, but the cracks were widening. Inside their steel and concrete confidence, the men guarding the pipelines had no access to those numbers. They lived in the small world of their post, of cigarettes and card games, and the occasional training drill where they were reminded to look for suspicious behavior near the line. Yet even they could feel some larger tension growing in the air, like the pressure in the pipes they barely noticed. The day the oil fields became rivers of fire began like many others. Hazy sun over the flat fields, the distant outline of refinery towers shimmering in the morning light, a faint smell of fuel carried by a lazy breeze. Ion woke from a shallow sleep with a headache, rubbed his eyes, and stepped outside to relieve the night watch. The sky was pale blue, almost innocent. Somewhere a lark sang. He took his place by the sandbag wall, adjusted his rifle strap, and exchanged a few half-hearted jokes with Petre about the quality of their rations. The war, for a brief moment, moment, felt like it was somewhere else again. Then the sirens in Ploiești began to wail. At first the sound was distant, thin. They'd heard it many times. Ion didn't even look up immediately, but the pitch climbed in a way he hadn't heard before, joined by another, then another, until the air was full of a layered, howling chorus that made the hairs on his arms stand up. He looked toward the city and saw a faint, glinting thread in the high sky. Bombers, dozens of them, sunlight flashing on wings as they moved in formation. A moment later, the first flak bursts appeared around them, tiny black flowers blooming in clusters. The rumble of engines rolled over the fields like approaching thunder. Another raid, Petre muttered, but his voice lacked conviction. Ion raised his binoculars, the metal cold against his brow, and tried to focus on the shapes overhead. They seemed different today, tighter, angrier. In Vogel's command post, the atmosphere was electric. Reports crackled in over field telephones and radios, each voice adding another piece to a picture moving too fast for any one man to fully grasp. Bombers approaching from the southwest, altitude, fortress formation, fighters engaged. The Oberleutnant barked orders, his fingers stabbing at positions on the map. Smoke generators were activated around key installations, belching dark clouds meant to blind enemy bombardiers. Flak batteries were ordered to shift fire patterns, to account for altitude and speed. Vogel believed, because he had to, that this was still a problem of trajectories and timing, of metal against metal. The idea that something inside his defended zone had been quietly rewired to turn any strike into catastrophe had never crossed his mind. In the darkness under Jack Monroe's flight goggles, the world was a jumble of instrument lights, shouted headings, and the distant glow of fires from earlier raids that had never quite gone out. They had been briefed that the defenses would be intense, that Ploiești was hot in every sense of the word. As they neared the target area, he could feel the plane shudder with every nearby flak burst. Each shock a reminder that men on the ground were trying very hard to kill them. Through the nose, the bombardier cursed again. Smoke's thick. Wait, I have secondary markers. I see the storage tanks. Stand by. Jack held the bomber steady, ribs aching from tension. When the call came, bombs away, it was almost a relief. The plane lurched upward as tons of explosives dropped free, and he banked away according to plan, trusting that whatever happened below would be enough to justify the risk they were taking. Down on the fields, Ion heard a strange new sound, one that did not fit his familiar catalog of war noises. It was a kind of rushing hiss, a sustained exhale, layered under the distant booms of exploding bombs. At first, he thought it was wind, but the air was stagnant. Then the ground beneath his boots vibrated slightly, and he realized the sound was rising from below, not passing overhead. The pipeline, usually a silent thing, began to speak in a roar. Somewhere along its length, a valve had been stressed past its failing point, its weakened parts giving way under the sudden surge of pressure created by emergency rerouting and damaged storage capacity. A fracture, small at first, opened like a cut in the side of a vein, and pressurized crude oil jetted out into the world. The first jet did not burn. It sprayed into the air like a dark fountain, spattering the ground, soaking grass and gravel and the lower boards of buildings. Men shouted, some running toward it with confusion on their faces. This was an industrial accident, an inconvenience, nothing more. Ion took a few steps in that direction, covering his face with his sleeve as the heavy odor of raw petroleum hit him. Then, somewhere far off, one of the bombs found a tank farm whose already damaged shell could not withstand another hit. A massive explosion rolled across the plains, a blossom of orange and black, and a wave of incandescent debris arced outward. A fragment, small and invisible in the chaos, fell toward the fields, still glowing. It is hard to describe the precise moment when the line between technical failure and apocalyptic vision is crossed. One instant, there was a spraying arc of dark oil, and a cluster of men trying to understand it. The next, there was a flash, so bright it seemed to cut the world in half, followed by a sound like the tearing of a giant sheet of metal. The spilled oil ignited not as a timid pool fire, but as if the earth itself had been waiting to exhale flame. The jet became a torch. The soaked ground became a carpet of fire. Heat slammed into Ion's face, forcing him to stagger back, arms raised, as the air turned solid with heat. Behind him, someone screamed, a high, raw sound. Then, another voice shouted for everyone to move, to get back, to do something, anything. Where the pipeline had ruptured, the pressure did not drop quickly enough to strangle the flow. Instead, the fire climbed backward along the stream, licking its way toward the severed joint, and from there it found every tiny crack and weakness along the line. The valves sabotaged weeks earlier were now out points of catastrophic opportunity. One assembly, deliberately misaligned, failed, and tore free, spraying more fuel into a world already aflame. Another, its relief mechanism compromised, held pressure when it should have vented, leading to a sudden explosive break further down the line. One after another, like links in a chain, the system began to betray itself. From the air, the effect was horrifying and strangely beautiful. As Jack's bomber turned away from the immediate flak zone, one of the gunners shouted over the intercom, "Jesus, you seeing this?" Jack risked a glance out the side window. Below, the oil region was no longer just a pattern of smokestacks and storage tanks. It was a spiderweb of fire. Thin, writhing lines of orange and white traced across the dark ground, connecting larger patches of flame, as if someone had drawn rivers of light on a map. Where a pipeline ran above ground, it burned like a fuse. Where it lay buried shallowly, the heat seeped up in long scars. He had seen cities bombed before, had watched blocks burn, but this was different. This was the fuel itself rebelling. Inside Ploiești, Elena stood at a window, the glass trembling with each distant explosion, and watched the horizon turn into something no one in the city would ever forget. At first, there had been the usual bursts of flak and columns of smoke. Then, a strange glow began to form along the ground in the direction of the fields. It spread, thin at first, then thicker, pulses of brightness moving along lines invisible to those who did not know where the pipelines ran. She felt a chill that had nothing to do with temperature. This was what the engineer had meant by rivers. The trap they had set, built on tiny manipulations of metal and timing, had met the raw violence of the bombing and produced something almost mythic. Beside her, the mechanic crossed himself slowly, eyes wide. "God forgive us," he whispered. "We turned the land into a torch." Out at the pipeline outpost, chaos shattered the old routines. Men ran in every direction, some toward the flames with pitiful tools, buckets, shovels, a few fire extinguishers that hissed uselessly against the inferno, others away from it, driven by instinct stronger than orders. Heat rolled over the fields, igniting dry grass tens of meters from the main blaze. The wooden walls of the guard shack caught fire, a low crackling that quickly turned into a roaring as the structure was swallowed. Ion pulled a burned man away from a collapsing fence, his hands blistering from the contact, and dragged him toward a ditch, only to realize the ditch itself was filling with burning liquid. The oil, seeking the lowest point, poured into every depression in the ground, carrying flame with it. Trenches meant for defense became channels for fire. Vogel tried to coordinate a response, but his carefully drawn maps offered no guidance for a situation where the protected asset itself had become a weapon against its protectors. His calls to shut valves met with panicked reports of controls that would not move, of stations already abandoned, of men who could not reach their posts because the paths between were engulfed. Some of his flak crews began to falter as the heat waves reached their positions, sweat streaming down their faces, lungs choking on the thick, oily smoke. Fighters still clawed at the bombers overhead for a time, but even their pilots could see that the ground was changing. The defense of Ploiești was no longer a matter of guns and altitudes. It was a matter of whether anyone would remain alive to count shells when the glow finally faded. As the day bled into dusk, the fires did not dim, they intensified. Oil that had not yet burned during the initial impact now found new paths to the surface through warped piping and ruptured joints. Storage tanks, heated beyond tolerance by nearby blazes, suffered boil-over, their contents suddenly spewing in deadly waves that surged outward before igniting. To someone watching from a safe hill, if such a place could be found, that day, the scene might have looked like some ancient god of fire had chosen to walk the earth, each step a new fountain of flame. The phrase, "rivers of fire," would not be a metaphor, it would be a literal description. Night finally came, but darkness never arrived. The burning oil lit the sky for kilometers around, a lurid, unsteady glow that made stars vanish and turned faces into masks of copper and shadow. Jack's bomber, long since on its way back to Italy, had been replaced by other aircraft, reconnaissance planes snapping photos, pilots of later waves glimpsing a landscape transformed. Even from that distance, the heat distortion shimmered in their lenses. The reports they carried back would speak of unprecedented fires, of pipelines visibly aflame, of entire sectors of the oil region rendered unusable for an unknowable time. On the ground, Ion moved through a world reduced to fragments and instinct. At some point he had lost his rifle. He could not remember where. His uniform jacket was singed, his hair smelled of smoke, and his throat burned with every breath. He and Petra had become separated evaporated in the confusion. Each time he thought he saw his friend's shape in the flickering light, it turned out to be another staggering figure, another coughing silhouette. He found shelter for a while behind a concrete support, coughing and spitting black phlegm, watching as a line of flame crawled along the path where the pipeline ran beneath the surface. It moved slowly but inexorably, like a living thing following the blood in an artery. "No one can touch these pipelines," he heard his own voice say, from some memory that might as well have belonged to someone else. And he laughed once, a harsh, broken sound, before another cough cut it off. Elena spent the night moving between safe houses, carrying messages that no longer fit the careful phrasing of earlier reports. There was no need now to speak in euphemisms about reduced capacity or maintenance delays. The news was simple. A large part of Romania's oil infrastructure was burning and would continue to burn for days. In one cellar, crowded with people seeking shelter from the unnatural dawn outside, someone asked her, "Did we do this?" The question hung in the air, heavy as smoke. She thought of the exactly positioned valves, of the detailed maps, of the packets hidden on metal in quiet rooms, and she also thought of the bombs falling from gray skies, of distant men with foreign accents planning their own part of the attack. "We helped the fire find its path," she said finally. The rest was always there, waiting. In the weeks that followed, the fires would be slowly beaten down by exhausted crews, by deliberate flooding of some areas, by the simple exhaustion of available fuel at the surface. Blackened ground would remain where fields once grew. Twisted pipes, warped by heat, would lie exposed like bones. Storage tanks, half collapsed and peeling, would stand as empty shells against a hazy sky. The smell would linger, burnt oil, scorched metal, a sour tang on every gust of wind. Investigators from Bucharest and Berlin would arrive, their cars caked with ash, and they would walk through the ruins carrying clipboards and measuring tools, trying to quantify loss in barrel counts and repair estimates. On paper, they would write that production had been severely reduced, that capacity could perhaps be restored with time, materials, and labor. In private, some of them would whisper that something fundamental had broken, not just in steel, but in belief. The old confidence that Ploiești and its veins were invulnerable, that the fortress of oil could withstand any assault, lay in ruins alongside the melted pipes. German officers would argue over blame, some accusing flak commanders of failing to stop the bombers, others muttering about Romanian negligence, a few, quieter and more perceptive, wondering aloud how so many accidental failures could align so perfectly with the enemy's attack. For the men who had once stood guarding the pipelines, the memory would not be of charts and arguments. It would be of heat and light, and the sick realization that the thing they had trusted most, the idea of safety, was an illusion. Ion, recovering in a makeshift infirmary with lungs scarred from smoke inhalation and hands wrapped in bandages, listened to rumors that the front was collapsing, that Russians were advancing into Romania, that the government might change sides. The world had been turned upside down in more ways than one. When he finally stepped outside again weeks later, the horizon looked wrong without the familiar shape of intact towers and tidy tank farms. In their place rose jagged shapes and skeletal frames. He walked once along the edge of the old pipeline route, staring at sections where the earth was black and glassy. In some places, the soil had melted and rehardened, trapping small stones in a dark, glossy matrix like insects in amber. Each step crunched faintly under his boots. From Italy, Jack Monroe read later that the Romanian front had cracked, that the country had switched allegiance, that German control over its precious oil had been severed. The official histories he would see after the war would debate how much the burning of Ploiești and its pipelines had hastened that shift, how much it starved panzer units on the Eastern Front, how much it limited Luftwaffe sorties. He would recognize aerial photographs of those days, the ones showing bright streaks of flame under a haze of smoke, and remember the sight from his window. Rivers of fire carving patterns into the land. The statistics did not capture the raw, terrifying beauty of it, nor the knowledge that, for all their efforts and sacrifices, some of the most decisive blows had been delivered by those on the ground, quietly turning arrogance into vulnerability. As for Elena, she would move through the last months of the war with the same quiet determination, helping now not just to cripple fuel lines, but to guide people through the chaos of changing regimes and advancing armies. In the years afterward, when conversations turned to the war, most people would talk about battles and leaders, about big names and dates. A few, those who had lived near Ploiești, would talk instead about that day in 1944 when the ground burned and night refused to fall, when men who had mocked the possibility of danger watched the very thing they guarded rise up in flames around them. Sometimes, in her small apartment, Elena would sit by the window and look toward the direction of the old fields, now partly reclaimed, partly scarred. She would think of metal and pressure, of maps and whispers, of the precise moment when a hidden weakness met a violent blow, and she would understand that history was was often made not only by the largest bombs, but by the smallest adjustments to the things others believed could never break. In the end, the story of Romania's oil in 1944 was one of overconfidence punished. Guards who had laughed at the idea of sabotage, officers who had drawn neat circles of flak and believed them impenetrable, planners who thought in terms of static defenses against a dynamic enemy. All of them had built their comfort on a fragile foundation. When the Allied bombers returned and the saboteurs' invisible work took effect, the fortress did not crumble in a neat, orderly way. It erupted, violently and unpredictably, into rivers of fire that lit the decline of the Axis war machine from within. The pipelines that had carried fuel to keep tanks and aircraft alive became, for one unforgettable season, blazing scars across the Romanian earth, proving in the harshest possible way that in total war, nothing truly vital is ever beyond reach.